Hello world, welcome to another version of a hot and sizzling commentary on the George Zimmerman trial, if you want to call it that. That's really stretching it. Call it a trial. I would call it a deception of justice in Sanford, Florida. Not a trial, it's a deception of justice. That is a more appropriate title that you can call it. Now, first of all, I'd like to start out about talking about what has happened in this case and why I call it a deception of justice in Sanford, Florida, because one of the reasons is because the judge in this case has ruled and determined that race will not be allowed to be mentioned in this case by either lawyer. Race is not an issue according to the judge. So it will not be allowed to be argued or any evidence of race allowed to be introduced in this case. Albeit George Zimmerman made the comment on the 911 tape that those fucking punks always get away. And at the time he made that comment, he knew that the suspect, Trayvon, was a black young man. George Zimmerman knew that the person that he was talking about when he said those punks always get away was a black man. Now, we all know, using common sense, that what he was referring to when he said those. We all know that any white person, when they say those people, is referring to black people. If a white person is looking at two groups of people, one group is white and one group is white, and they say to the person they're talking to, those people over there always get away. Now we know, using our common sense, that that white person is referring to a group of black people. Obviously the judge don't have common sense, or is not applying common sense when she says that there's no evidence of race and that race should not be considered in this case. We all know that those people refers to black people. Attorney General Holder was correct when he said that Americans are just a bunch of cowards when it comes to talking about race. And the judge in this case seems to be a big old coward and is upholding institutional racism when she says that race is not to be considered in this case because race does not exist in America. Race did not. This case has nothing to do with race. This is just another example of systematic and institutional racism that protects the existence of racism. You see, there's two concepts of racism. One is an individual act of racism, when one believes that racism can only exist if somebody performs an individual act of racism. The other concept of racism involves institutional racism, not individual racism, but institutional racism. Racism is seen as emanating from institutions. You see, to say that racism does not exist in this case is just to protect the system of racism that exists in this case. The judge's decision to not allow race to be argued in this case because there is no evidence of racism is in itself an act of racism. The judge is basically protecting the institution of racism by keeping people from talking about racism. institutional racism is protected whenever it is not allowed to be challenged. Whenever people are prevented from talking about racism, racism is preserved. The fact that Zimmerman said those fucking punks always get away, and he was talking about a black man, is evidence of racism. It's enough evidence that it should go to the jury and not to be summarily dismissed by a judge, because common sense tells all of us that he was talking about a black man. Common sense tells everybody. Anybody got common sense knows what the man was talking about when he said those people. And the only person that is in a position to protect institutional racism is the judge. And that's what she did. She summarily decided that we are not going to allow racism to be talked about because there's no evidence of racism, despite the fact that what George Zimmerman said when he said those fucking punks always get away. We all know what he meant when he said that. He was talking about a black man. There was evidence that there were 7 or 8 burglaries in the neighborhood, all committed by young black men. Now, they want to make that evidence available to justify his acts, but they don't want to make it available or be considered when it can be shown that it was racism that was at the base of his intent. You see, institutional racism is the progenitor of racism in America. The individual acts of racism that people do every day, from discriminating against people on their job, or beating up somebody because of their color, it all emanates from institutional racism. The progenitor of individual mindsets, racist mindsets, comes from institutions or cultural institutions. Now, a lot of people say that there's no racism going on in this case. This case is not about race, but about the murder of a young black man. I would like to challenge that. This case is everything about racism. We have a white judge, a white prosecutor, white defense attorneys, and all white jury in Sanford, Florida. Now, we can get a more diverse jury and a more diverse representation of lawyers in Iowa, or in Alaska, or in South or North Dakota. Here we are in the South, in Florida, and we have a black man, young black man that was killed. In his case, is being tried in a courtroom by all white people. White judge, white defense attorneys, white prosecutors, and an all-white jury. Can you believe that? You get a more diverse jury in Alaska. This is not about racism. This is nothing but institutional racism. The DA and the prosecution are on the same side. Look at the trial. The DA and the prosecution appear to be on the same side of the bench. Yes, and I'll go into this in a little bit later and show you why I say that this case is a deception of justice and just a mischaracter of justice. The judge's decision not to allow race to be considered in this case on the grounds that there's no evidence of race being an issue, despite what the man said, despite what Zimmerman said when he said those people, is nothing but a racist decision itself. It's nothing but the protection of an apartheid law enforcement and judicial system in Sanford, Florida. That's what the exclusion of race in this case amounts to. There's no basis to exclude it. You see, racism is not just an individual act. Racism is an institutional act. However, in America, in our court system, racism is only recognized as the act of an individual. However, history shows us that racism has always been an institutional act and not an individual act. Matter of fact, racism was brought to America as an institutional system. Racism has never been, racism was never introduced to America as an individual occurrence of an individual person. Racism was introduced to America as an institutional concept. It was brought to America as an institution in and of itself. Remember slavery? Slavery was legal. It was legalized. Slavery was not the act of an individual. Slavery was the legalized enslavement of black people. That was not an individual act. However, our courts want to not recognize the existence or to live in a fantasy world that does not recognize the existence of institutional racism. Institutional racism exists in America just like it did in the late 1700s, early 1700s, early 1600s, late 1600s, 1800s, 1900s, 20th century, 21st century. Institutional racism has always existed in America. However, our government does not want to recognize that there is institutional racism, and the judge's decision to exclude race as a factor in this case is an example of institutional racism. Yes, the judge's exclusion of race as being considered evidence in this case is an act of institutional racism, just like legalized slavery was, and apartheid in South Africa is an example of institutional racism. Whenever you prevent from talking about racism, it protects the institution of racism. Yes? Let's not talk about it. So now we can sit around and fantasize and live in a fantasy world that doesn't exist. We can fantasize. Now we can sit around and make believe that racism don't exist because we don't talk about it. However, like Eric Holder said, America is a bunch of cowards when it comes to racism because they refuse to talk about it or recognize that it exists. Not only on an individual basis, but on an institutional basis. You see, the institution of racism is the progenitor of racism. The institution of racism is the father of racism. The institutional racism creates the mindset of racism. It is institutional racism or a culture of racism that comes out of your institutions. It is the institutions of your society that are responsible for teaching people the mindset that they have regarding race in America. And the mindset and the individual acts of racism is merely a system